Hi, I'm Duncan Astle from the University of Cambridge, and welcome to this webinar about belonging in school. We all want schools to be as inclusive as possible, but in the current climate of stretched resources and high demands on staff time, that can feel like a daunting prospect. That's why we designed Belonging in School, a free set of resources to help guide schools through the process of creating their own inclusion policy. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to inclusion. Any good policy will need to be specific to its local context. Our goal is not to tell schools what they should do, but to guide them through the process of how they might create their own good inclusion policy and make positive steps to change. To get the most out of school, you need to feel like you belong in school. But for many children, especially those experiencing neurodevelopmental differences, school can feel like an alienating place and they can face more barriers to engaging with school. That's why we put belonging at the heart of our resources. The neurodivergent people we spoke to said that one of the most crucial things for them was to feel that they are a valued part of their community and that they are safe and that they belong in school. In the workshops that we ran as part of Belonging in School, that was a really strong recurring theme. In this resource, our goal has been to provide schools with the tools and strategies they can use to reflect on their choices, values, and existing policies around inclusion, and then to draw on this information to create good local inclusion policies that meet the needs of more learners. Belonging in School will guide you through a process you might take to creating your own policy and show you that even with the current resources, positive changes are possible at a local level. And now I'll hand over to Natalia, who will tell you a little more about how we put the resources together.
In November 2022, we participated in the Global Scientific Conference on Human Flourishing. As part of this conference, we organized the Diverse Trajectories to Good Developmental Outcomes workshop. The workshop aimed to bring together our scientific understanding of developmental diversity with pragmatic policy recommendations for educators. We welcome leaders from academic research, the charity sector, clinical practice, education, and policy making to our event, as well as those with lived experience of neurodivergence. One important output from the workshop was an initial policy briefing, which was the first step towards our journey to Belonging in School. Belonging in School thoroughly expands on this initial briefing, providing both information and practical recommendations for inclusion. In Part 1, we give an overall introduction to inclusion as a whole. In Part 2, we provide you with practical recommendations about how to create your own inclusive policies in your school. If you're just starting out, we recommend taking a look at our executive summary, which provides an overview of all the resources you can find in Belonging in School.
Hi, I'm Dr. Alyssa Alcorn. Duncan and Natalia have already told you a bit about the goals of Belonging in School, but what exactly is in the resource? I'll give you a bit more detail about the tools and how they might help support your planning.
The resource has 3 documents that work together, including a 5-page executive summary, which Natalia already mentioned as the best place to get started. Part 1 is an introductory level document, giving some background around inclusion and a tour of the big ideas. One of its main purposes is to help you decide if the tools we're offering might be useful for you. If so, then it's time to go on to Part 2, and this is where all the nuts and bolts planning guidance is, to take you from big ideas to implementation with a lot of useful tips along the way. It also has a section specifically discussing measuring the impact of policy changes you make. All 3 documents have the same audience, and that's professionals working in schools or with schools. Hopefully, that's many of you joining us for this webinar. I'm saying professionals because Belonging in School isn't only for teachers or senior leaders. One of our biggest messages throughout the resource is that all school staff members play a really important role in making schools inclusive places and making them positive and supportive for learners. The wider community around every school is also a really important part of the picture because everyone's values and actions matter. We think belonging in school is likely to be most relevant for primary schools across the UK nations. The guidance isn't tailored to any particular nation or set of legislation. However, the planning tools like the action cycle could potentially be applied at any level of education, not only primary level. Belonging in School offers 3 types of tools to support inclusive policy development. We've got an action cycle that's tailored for policy planning, then 4 approaches or views on inclusive policy planning that are structured around the action cycle, and we'll come back to those in a minute. Finally, we've got 12 suggested changes. These are discrete changes to practice or policy that could help make your school more inclusive, especially for pupils with neurodevelopmental differences. And we'll come back to those closer to the end of the webinar. You may have noticed I said the resource offers tools for inclusive policy development, not developing inclusion policies. Belonging in School talks about both inclusion policies and inclusive school policies, but doesn't use these interchangeably. Inclusion policies would be dedicated policies addressing inclusion issues or legal obligations for particular groups. Inclusive school policies could refer to policies in any area of the school that are designed to be accessible to all. For example, your school could have an inclusive policy on their uniforms, seating, or headphone use in class. Inclusion policies are important, but we encourage you to think about inclusive policies wherever you can, because all parts of the school day and different physical parts of the building are all impacting children's experiences, their sense of belonging, and how they're accessing learning. Revising or creating inclusive policies is a big job for any school, and it will take time and iteration. 2 of our big messages throughout Belonging in School are that planning matters and progress matters. We really think about policy development as being a living and growing process. You're likely to be looking at going through several different cycles of planning, making changes, measuring, and reflecting on what happened. Not a massive, one and done, throw it all out policy overhaul that will somehow fix inclusion. That's just not realistic. The goal instead is to keep making progress toward greater inclusion, whatever your starting point is now, and to keep in mind that even modest changes can be making a big daily life difference for learners and for staff. The action cycle is a tool we offer to help break things down into manageable, measurable steps. You might already have seen action cycles in another context as they're used in many different fields. This one focuses specifically on policy planning and has 5 steps. First, get prepared to engage in the planning process. This is about project management and is all about practicalities, like what your focus is going to be, the timeline, and who will be involved in the process. Next, you need to assess your current situation and resources. What is happening now around your area of focus? What do people know? What are they doing? What resources and constraints are operating here? The next step is sort of a mini cycle around planning, in which you're moving from this big focus down to specific goals and which actions you're going to take to meet those goals. Then, how will you measure the effects of changes you make? You also need to be checking this planning for feasibility. Does it all add up into a plan that's going to be feasible for your staff and for your learners? Finally, then, you get to implement your planning, begin measuring, and then in the last step, be evaluating and reflecting on the changes you've made. This is a cycle, not a linear process. What you find out in step 5 will help set you up for the next iteration of planning. Have your changes worked? Why or why not? What aspects of policy or practice might your school want to work on next? The largest part of the Belonging in School content is about ways you could develop inclusive policy planning using this action cycle. We call these our 4 approaches. They are not different paths toward good inclusion, but to some extent they're different destinations. They've got different visions of what counts as inclusion and how your school might work toward that. They pose different questions that you need to answer as you work through the action cycle.
The next part of the webinar is about our 4 approaches. We'll go through each approach to give you the main ideas and a little bit about how it can support inclusion. Please do keep in mind, though, that this webinar is just a short introduction. It doesn't include all the details you need to actually implement the approaches. For that, we'd encourage you to look at the written guidance, especially the details in part 2.
The first approach in belonging in school is committing to inclusion as belonging. This focuses on whether children feel that they are accepted, safe, and part of their community. By committing to putting belonging at the heart of your approach to inclusion, you'll have the opportunity to specifically optimize for belongingness and integration in your school.
Belonging is critical to inclusive education because schools are communities.
We'll hear from Dr. Kate Baker, a researcher and clinician based at the University of Cambridge. She'll be speaking about the value of a belongingness-centered approach to school inclusion.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kate Baker. I'm a doctor at Addenbrooke's Hospital and a research group leader at the MRC Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit, and I'm also the chair of governors at a local primary school.
This approach to inclusion means adopting a focus on pupil belonging in your school policies and activities. A pupil could be present at school, participating, and receiving supports, but those feelings of community, safety, and acceptance might still be missing. Committing to inclusion as belonging means working to understand pupils' feelings about whether and when they belong within their school community, and taking action to increase pupils' belonging. Promoting a sense of belongingness has recently been highlighted as a priority in UK policymaking, specifically as it pertains to improving mental health outcomes in neurodivergent individuals.
I think developing a strong sense of belonging to a school community is critically important for every young person. And the types of experiences of belonging to that community really set up lifelong expectations, are really formative for how a person then emerges out of that school world within a world and becomes part of wider society. Because belonging is very close to the idea of feeling safe. So if you don't feel safe or comfortable in your school environment, or you don't feel like you're listened to, or you don't feel like your needs are being met, then natural response is to feel threatened and not to want to be there. So it's important because without considering how to enable each person to belong, they'll find a way out.
Pupils' perceptions about whether or not they belong within their school communities affects how they progress through school. There is a large, well-established body of research about school belongingness, possible ways to measure it, and how it affects different outcomes across childhood and beyond. Belongingness is related to improved academic performance, increased pupil and staff well-being, and improved resilience, stress management, and self-efficacy among pupils. It's valuable to mention that belongingness is highly personal and local. It won't look the same across all individuals. This is why it's so important to work with pupils to find out what it means for them.
I think it's really important to think about what belonging would mean for different people. If you think about communities in general, as grown-ups, we contribute to communities in lots of different ways. And what looks like successful belonging is hugely different for different people.
If you're interested in adopting this approach, the first step is to find out more about what belonging and not belonging means to your school community. When do pupils feel like they belong or not belong, and why? What are some measurable goals that you can set in order to ensure that you're improving pupils' sense of belongingness over time? Remember that cultivating a culture of belongingness involves looking at school dynamics and processes across the whole school, including those that involve educators and other school staff.
Belonging really matters for inclusive education because it sets up each child's expectations about how they relate to their community and to other people within the world. It's the critical ingredient to understanding how each person can be valued within society, what contribution they can make, and the relationships they have with other people.
Approach 2, participatory policy design, is about increasing the inclusiveness and accessibility of school policies by including a wider range of people in making those policies.
Participatory policy can be great because it can make a real difference to children's lives.
Joining us for this approach is Professor Holly Joseph from the University of Reading. She was one of the Belonging in School workshop contributors and has experience in developing participatory projects with children, families, and communities.
Research is primarily on reading development and reading difficulties, I used to use eye movements to understand the process of reading, but now I've moved on to much kind of broader issues around community, society, inequality and social justice, and with sort of reading in the sort of centre of that.
Following this approach, policies would be developed with and evaluated by the wider school community, not staff members alone.
I guess the most important thing about participatory policy development is to include a diverse range of voices to ensure that a diverse range of interests and needs are acknowledged and met as far as is possible. Participatory policy development is really important in schools because schools have to cater for a very, very wide range of children, and often the perspectives and voices of those children are not part of that decision-making process.
Participatory policy design, or any type of participatory design, can be a complicated and confusing area for 3 reasons. First, there's a large number of related terms with overlapping and interconnected meanings, like participatory research, co-design, co-production, and even more. Depending on your role, some of these terms may already be on your radar. For simplicity, we'll keep talking here about participatory design of policies. Second, participatory design isn't one single method. It's really more like a family of methods sharing big principles. This means there's many right ways to do it, depending on who's working together and the problems they need to solve. Third and finally, this area is just complicated. Working with the wider community to make and evaluate policy decisions may be very different than how your school's policy making works now, and there will be a lot of logistical decisions to consider. So, worrying over whether you're doing participatory design the right way isn't necessarily helpful. Many ways are right. What matters most is thinking carefully through what kind of voices you're going to bring into your policy process and how you're going to enable that participation. All this so far has been pretty high level. So what can it actually look like to include people? You might use focus groups as a way to consult people and shape planning priorities, or do something like ask pupils to take the school iPads round and photograph spaces they think are good sensory environments or bad ones. Participation can be face-to-face, written, arts-based, or almost anything. Reading about existing projects is a great way to go shopping for ideas, what worked or didn't work for other people. It's really worth investing planning time to make your activities themselves inclusive and accessible, whatever they are and whatever part of the school community you're focusing on. Here, Holly shares an experience from one of her projects about the importance of getting the practicalities right.
Yeah, focus groups are a great place to start, I think. I think people can feel less intimidated when they're in a small group. And one thing we found was that focus groups worked much better in the community. So asking parents to come into school, they may have had negative experiences of school as children. It might not be somewhere that they feel that comfortable, that safe. So actually going out to the community where people live, giving them cake, giving them coffee, that's what we did, and being in an environment where they feel able to share how they feel with you. I think that's a really, really great way to sort of start.
There are two main ways that participatory policy design can contribute to inclusive schools. Opening up planning processes and decision-making diversifies the viewpoints and values and experiences that are going into policy creation. Policies are more likely to support people where more people have been involved in making them. However, being heard and participating in decision-making can in themselves be an important way to include learners and families in the school community. If participatory policy development sounds interesting to you, remember that you don't have to try everything at once. It's okay to start simple and see how it goes. You might start with one area of policy, one part of the action cycle, or one group of stakeholders. Including different people in your planning, even if you're starting modestly, can lead to different outcomes than when staff are planning alone. The most important question to ask before trying anything in this area is whether people are really ready to listen to one another. From her own experience, Holly thinks that the experience of participation and listening in itself can be incredibly valuable with respect to making schools more inclusive.
So this can be really hard, it can be time consuming, nobody's saying it's easy, but it is worth it because you can make a difference to children's lives. Sometimes children feel that they're not included, that their voices aren't heard, that they feel different and outside the kind of mainstream of what most of the children in their classroom are like, and by including the voices of those children and listening to them, you can make them feel more included.
The third planning approach in belonging in school is inclusion by design. The central idea of this approach is to change the learning environment to create a context for learning that is accessible and challenging for everyone.
Inclusion by design allows us to look at more universal approaches that may be vital for some students, but will be valuable for everybody.
In this section, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Jamie Galpin. Jamie is experienced in designing learning environments within a variety of education settings and was a key contributor at one of our workshops.
I'm a developmental psychologist with special networks, and my research focuses on universal approaches to support for children and young people.
When exploring inclusion by design, a phrase you will come across is Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short. This is a specific instance of inclusion by design as it applies to education settings. But don't let the word universal throw you. It doesn't mean giving every student the same. If anything, it means the opposite, building in flexibility so that learning is accessible for everyone. Let's listen to Jamie.
So inclusion by design is a proactive approach to supporting children and young people, where inclusion is built in as opposed to bolted on. It's preemptive support for the inherent variability of all children. For schools, I think it's a really effective way of providing support. It can sometimes feel overwhelming to have a huge variety of needs that we need to kind of adopt these isolated interventions for. Inclusion by design allows us to look at more universal approaches that may be vital for some students, but will be valuable for everybody.
Imagine this example. A child finds the hubbub of school arrival overwhelming. It can sometimes take hours for them to settle into class. So the family ask if the child can arrive at a slightly different time from their classmates to avoid the scrum. Well, that's one solution, but a universal solution could be instead to implement a soft start. Offer everyone a 30-minute arrival window. This makes arrival less chaotic for everyone. Inclusion by design can be very time efficient in the long run. Rather than constantly thinking of accommodations for individuals, the standard practice changes. Second, it can be very low cost, even when rolled out to everyone. Third, the benefits are for everyone, not just children with the appropriate paperwork. Fourthly, it can reduce stigma. Children are not required to seek permission for an accommodation if the standard practice becomes more flexible. Finally, you may never be able to optimally meet all needs all the time, but inclusion by design is about meeting more needs as standard.
Schools will benefit from inclusion by design, I think, in two ways. Both the staff, in terms of a much more efficient use of time and a much more sense of control over being able to support children and young people, controlling that learning environment and making it better fit the children they have. And there's also benefit for children and young people in terms of they get a greater sense of belonging, being in an environment that feels like it was built for them.
As a planning approach, inclusion by design can be distinguished from other approaches in belonging in school by its explicit focus on making a school more inclusive by default. Rather than more specific exemptions or exceptions, the end result of inclusion by design is a system with flexible ways of engaging, accessing information, participating, and showing what you know.
Inclusion by design, from a mindset perspective, begins from the position of recognizing exclusion, of looking at our current learning environments and saying, who can't access these spaces? Who can't access this lesson? And then proactively looking to design for that individual. And in designing that solution for that individual, you then take a step back and say, how can I expand this out to everybody?
Many good examples of inclusion by design can be extremely simple and low, or even no cost. Some changes might be more ambitious. In Belonging in School, you'll find a great example of a school that trialled different types of seating. Here's another example from Jamie.
So, an example of inclusion by design would be where we take differentiation and look at embedding it in our everyday practice. So we may have differentiated a worksheet for a student that may have a high level of need around interpreting certain vocabulary. Now, rather than just producing that worksheet and giving it to one student, we make the option of that worksheet available to everybody and give the student some agency or choice in which worksheet they go for. This has the benefit of allowing multiple children to access information in different ways. It teaches us about children's self-concept, what they feel they're capable of accessing or engaging with, which in itself is very useful for us in terms of better understanding our learners and how we can support them. If we know that there's a child who has a different attentional focus, whereby it'll benefit them to utilize a fidget tool during their lesson, rather than just making a fidget tool available to that one student, we simply have a box of fidget tools available for all students. And that way we're making it clear that it's okay to be different. It's normal to be different.
To summarize, the key principles of inclusion by design are 1. To identify for one and then extend to many. 2. Design for inclusion and accessibility as standard. 3. What is the best universal approach might change over time. And 4. Offer flexibility and choice where possible.
The fourth and final policy planning approach is committing to be a neurodiversity affirming school. This approach is about using the ideas from the neurodiversity paradigm to shift school policies and practices, with the end goal of becoming a safe environment that does not stigmatize differences and offers support without judgment.
A neurodiversity affirmative school will be giving children what they need without judgment and without over-focusing on diagnostic labels.
For this approach, we're joined by Professor Sue Fletcher-Watson of the University of Edinburgh, a developmental psychologist with experience in neurodivergent development and neurodiversity affirming education.
Neurodiversity is just the fact that we're all different from each other in the way that our brains work. And what that means in schools is that we need to recognise how different children are from each other. One of the ways in which those differences are most prominent is when we look at differences between children with and without neurodevelopmental diagnoses, like autism or ADHD, things like that.
The idea of neurodiversity goes beyond any list of diagnoses. Neurodiversity describes the variation present across a group in our cognition, experiences, emotions, and more, a diversity of minds and brains. Neurodiversity includes and affects all people, not only those with neurodevelopmental differences. You may have previously heard the terms neurotypical and neurodivergent. These refer to people who are in the cognitive majority and in cognitive minorities, respectively. Describing someone as neurodivergent means that their information processing is less common, less typical of the group. It's not a judgment that they are unhealthy or deficient in any way. Difference is not wrong.
When we understand that our classrooms are neurodiverse, we need to understand that that means that children are learning in different ways. The neurodiversity paradigm reminds us that all those different ways of learning are equally valid and that schools have a responsibility to support all the children in their classrooms to thrive and learn and reach their full potential.
This diversity of brains and minds within our species is a biological fact supported by many types of evidence. Sue also mentioned the neurodiversity paradigm, which is a position or perspective on this biological fact of human diversity. Two key ideas in this paradigm are that neurodiversity is naturally occurring, and thus differences in our thought and our experiences are naturally occurring also. Second, that there is no normal brain. No type of brain or information processing is right or has more value and validity than another.
Neurodiversity is a relatively new word, but neurodiversity affirmation in schools is about more than just the language that you're using. You want to think deeply about how you view your pupils, how you show them that they're all valued, and how you ensure equality in the systems within your school.
This particular planning approach in belonging in school is about using the neurodiversity paradigm's values and perspectives to drive your practice and drive your planning in school. This is an approach that can support inclusion in multiple ways and has potentially extensive and long-lasting benefits across all of your learners. The values of the neurodiversity paradigm can be markedly different than education as usual, and in some cases adopting those values asks us to reject other messaging that can be very strong in our society and our education system. As one example, asking for and receiving support are often widely stigmatized across many areas of life, even in schools. Taking a neurodiversity affirming approach would seek to actively destigmatize use of supports and to clearly communicate that a person who does things independently does not have higher value than someone with many support needs. Everyone has a right to have their needs met. Part 2 of Belonging in School talks in more detail about how these principles might translate into practice as part of a neurodiversity affirming school. One more specific example would be around facilitating learners' self-understanding and self-advocacy. Here's Sue again.
A big part of neurodiversity affirmative practice in schools is giving children the language that they need to talk about themselves, who they are, what their needs are, and to advocate for themselves in class. And as a teacher, you have a responsibility to respond to those needs, to listen to your pupils, to believe them when they say that something is difficult, and to work with them creatively to find solutions that enable them to do and be their best.
In many ways, this approach is the most radical and asks schools to make the biggest changes. But we know some schools are up for the challenge now, and others are committed to working towards neurodiversity understanding and affirmation over time. And it will take time, with cycles of reflection and change. If you feel like you're at the very beginning, we'd encourage you to work on neurodiversity knowledge and attitudes in your school community and begin to shift deficit-focused narratives around needs, support, and help. As with the other 3 approaches, you can start small. What matters is starting.
You'll know that you have achieved your goal of becoming a neurodiversity affirmative school when every child in every classroom is given an equal opportunity to thrive, where they all have the support that they need.
So these 4 approaches we've just talked about and all the tools in belonging in school are just that. They're tools. It's up to you to decide whether or not to pick them up and use them in your context, because you're the one who will have local knowledge of your school community, your colleagues, and your resources. So you will need to make a decision about what makes sense in your context now. We know that after hearing about the approaches, you might be thinking that this does sound like a time investment, and it's true, it is. In some schools, it is going to be a longer-term goal to work toward that sort of policy planning cycle, and that's really okay. It also doesn't mean that there aren't positive actions that you can take right now around inclusion in your school. Earlier in the webinar, I mentioned that belonging in school also includes 12 suggested changes. These are discrete things about policy or practice that you could change now in your school to make it more inclusive. So let's look a little bit more at those.
The 12 changes cover areas like uniform policy, staff training, and adopting a focus on belonging within your school. Yes, we thought belongingness was so important that we put it in the resource twice. The 12 suggested changes really are suggestions, not a to-do list of steps that will produce good inclusion policy or outcomes. Just like the planning approaches, each suggestion may not fit equally well everywhere. Your school may also have made some of these changes already, which is great. If a school has the commitment and capacity for broader changes in inclusion policy and practice, we do strongly encourage you to keep going beyond the 12 suggested changes and engage with action cycles of planning and evaluation. Yes, it is a time investment, but with the potential to pay dividends, not only for pupils with neurodevelopmental differences, but for all pupils.
Thank you for joining us for this webinar. Belonging in School is a set of free resources for schools, and you can find them all at inclusion.mrc-cbu.cam.ac.uk. There are many people that I'd like to thank, especially Dr. Alyssa Alcorn and Natalia Zdorovtsova, for so much of the work that you can see in Belonging in School. Also really like to thank Dr. Shan Lewis, who did so much of the work around the original workshop. We'd like to thank our funders, the Templeton World Charity Foundation and the Medical Research Council, and we'd like to thank the many teachers, practitioners, academics, families, and young people who have been integral to putting Belonging in School together. Becoming more inclusive benefits everyone, not just neurodivergent learners, and we really hope that Belonging in School is really useful for you to make positive changes at a local school level.